In the shadows of history, behind the headlines in the courtrooms, there lies a forgotten dynasty, one whose name echoes with the silent ruin of millions. You've heard of the Sacklers, those modern titans of pharmaceutical power whose empire of pain cast a dark shadow over America. But before them, a family operated on a scale 10 times greater, industrializing addiction with a ruthless efficiency that reshaped continents and carved a new world order. They weren't just traders. They were architects of dependency, gefters of an empire built not on gold, but on human suffering. This is the story of the Sassoon family, opium lords who built modern India and bankrupted China, yet walked away honored as heroes. The tale begins in 1832. In a world still humming with the aftershocks of empire and revolution, a Jewish merchant family flees their ancestral home in Baghdad, pursued by a hostile governor wielding power like a weapon. David Sassoon, the patriarch, moves first to Iran and then sets his sights on British India, land that was less a colony and more a corporate state. Bombay, the city that would become Mumbai, was then a booming colonial port, energized by cotton exports flowing outward and silver floods pouring in. But beneath this vibrant trade was a monstrous engine fueled by an invisible poison, opium. The British East India Company was no mere enterprise. It was an empire within an empire. Its armies conquered, its courts passed laws, its administrators ruled vast swathes of land exceeding the size of many European nations. Authorized by the crown but answerable only to shareholders, it was as close as a corporation could get to sovereignty. By the early 19th century, it had transformed India not through traditional colonization, but through corporate conquest-winning wars, annexing kingdoms, and turning the subcontinent into a giant factory for a drug that would rewrite history. David Sassoon arrived here with next to nothing, but wielded 3 invaluable assets passed down from his father's legacy as chief treasurer in Baghdad: networks of trust, deep mercantile connections stretching from the Middle East to Asia, a profound understanding of power and politics, and impeccable timing, stepping into the perfect storm as the British devised a vast new economic scheme centered on opium. Before we dissect this plan, let's pause to understand the British obsession with China. The British elite, daily rituals steeped in tea, silk, and porcelain luxuries from the East that had by then become necessities, essentials infused into the fabric of British life. However, China was impermeable to British goods. Refined silk and porcelain couldn't be matched, and they had no use for British wool or manufactures. The stubborn reality. China had little demand for the empire's products, and insisted on payment in silver, a precious metal rapidly draining from British coffers. This unbalanced trade threatened the lifeblood of the British economy. Years of silver outflows threatened a monetary crisis capable of toppling the empire's global ambitions. Conventional commerce had failed. Negotiation, diplomacy, and attempts at opening markets bore no fruit. The answer, brutal and coldly calculated, was opium, a narcotic grown on British-controlled Indian soil, destined to corrode the very fabric of Chinese society. This was no clandestine operation. It was a state-sanctioned strategy of economic warfare. Cultivate vast poppy fields in India, process the opium in company-controlled factories, auction it off to trusted merchants, and flood China with the substance, exploiting millions as customers and turning a trade deficit into an unprecedented profit surge. David Sassoon saw the scheme for what it was, a corporate state's legalized addiction industry. But unlike others content to be mere middlemen, he envisioned empire-scale domination. Using his family's trusted networks, political acumen, and unique timing, he positioned the Sassoon family not just as merchants, but as essential operators controlling every link in the supply chain. This is the opening of a story where business, empire, addiction, and power collide, setting the stage for economic dominance, ethical decay, and a lesson echoing through centuries to our modern battles with pharmaceutical empires today. The opium trade was more than just commerce. It was a strategic weapon honed with surgical precision. As the British East India Company's poppy fields stretched across the fertile plains of Bengal and Malwa, the Sassoon family masterminded a vertically integrated empire within this empire. From seed to sale, they orchestrated a transport network that spanned perilous mountain passes, treacherous sea routes, and clandestine urban dens where addiction silently blossomed. David's genius lay in transforming an illicit economy into a corporate juggernaut. Unlike the rough-and-tumble smugglers who previously dotted the opium trade, the Sassoons imposed bureaucratic discipline. They refined processing techniques, standardized packaging, and established about a dozen monopolies in opium auctions, each tied directly to the East India Company's military and administrative apparatuses. It was a blueprint not just to dominate supply, but to manufacture demand, locking entire societies into cycles of dependency. But this sprawling economic machine was a double-edged sword, rippling far beyond the factory floor or auction house. In India, cultivating opium poppies drained resources and labor from food production, deepening rural poverty and famine vulnerability. Meanwhile, in China, the ritualistic destruction of societal cohesion was devastating and methodical, the quiet erosion of families, governance, and health, all undercut by addiction's corrosive grip. It was an empire fueled by human despair, yet proudly framed as civilizing mission and economic progress. The British Crown and Parliament knew the stakes. When Chinese authorities attempted to ban opium imports, it triggered a series of confrontations, the Opium Wars, that revealed the true nature of this corporate empire. Gunboats and diplomacy marched hand in hand to protect not just the trade, but a vision of Western supremacy backed by capitalism's darkest impulses. The war fought on China's southern coasts was a bloody testament to the lengths a mercantile empire would go to safeguard profit, even at the cost of sovereignty and millions of lives. Throughout this maelstrom stood the Sassoons, wielding influence as financiers, politicians, and social arbiters. Their fortunes grew immensely, their name embroidered into the architecture of colonial India, pillars of commerce, yet architects of ruin. Yet the paradox lingered. How do societies elevate men their deeds condemned? Beneath the veneer of respectability and philanthropy lay an abyss of moral conflict, where profit was prized over humanity, and the human cost was invisibly tallied in opiate haze. This era also presaged the modern pharmaceutical age. The Sassoons had industrialized addiction on a global scale before the term Big Pharma was coined, a chilling precursor to the commodification of human vulnerability. The mechanisms were disturbingly familiar: corporate consolidation, political lobbying, supply chain control, and cultural capture, all under the guise of progress and healing. As we turn to the family's next chapter, we trace how their empire intersected with shifting global power structures, declining dynasties, rising nation-states, and the transformations wrought by modern capitalism. How did they navigate the coming storms of reform, war, and eventual decolonization? And what shadows did their legacy cast long after the poppy fields withered? The story of the Sassoon dynasty is not merely historical. It is a mirror held up to our own era, where economic systems still weaponize substances for control, where the line between commerce and exploitation often blurs into darkness. But the devil's bargain carved a deeper wound than anyone imagined. The opium trade was not merely a transaction of commodities. It was a churning vortex of human despair and geopolitical catastrophe. The Sassoons, embedded within the nexus of commerce and colonial command, did more than capitalize on addiction. They commodified suffering into profit, reshaping the very architecture of empire and dependency. As the poppy fields flourished across India's fertile plains, entire agrarian economies pivoted away from food crops, tethered to the rhythmic pulse of opium production. The East India Company's factories mechanized the refinement process, transforming raw latex into a potent export that fed a vast black market hidden beneath layers of intrigue and diplomacy. The Sassoons wielded influence far beyond trade. They embedded themselves into provincial administrations, manipulating tax policies and trade licenses, ensuring their monopoly remained unchallenged. Yet the most insidious aspect lay in the trade's effect on China. Millions found themselves ensnared in addiction, their lives unraveling as opium dens mushroomed from Canton to Shanghai. Beyond the human toll, this addiction destabilized the Qing dynasty, eroding social order and undermining the authority of the imperial court. The British, backed by corporate interests like the Sassoons, were effectively weaponizing dependency as a tool of imperial conquest, crafting a new kind of colonial dominion, not achieved through warships alone, but through chemical chains. The resulting tensions ignited the Opium Wars, brutal conflicts that laid bare the collision between imperial greed and native resistance. When Chinese authorities seized and destroyed large stocks of opium, they unwittingly triggered global reverberations. Britain responded with military force to defend trade rights, marking the first explicit moment where addiction was a state-sponsored instrument of foreign policy. The Sassoon family sat at the heart of this maelstrom, profiting from both empire's ascendancy and China's unraveling. Through it all, their public image remained pristine. In British India, they were celebrated as pioneering entrepreneurs whose wealth underwrote infrastructure projects and colonial administrators' salaries. Honors plaques, even streets bore their name. The paradox was staggering. Men whose commerce sowed addiction and death were lauded as harbingers of progress and civilization. This duality exposes the recurring pattern of empire, a veneer of legitimacy draping over exploitative mechanisms, where morality bends beneath economic imperatives. The Sassoon story is not unique in history, but it is emblematic. It reveals how empires manage addiction as a systemic tool, normalized and bureaucratized into policy. Their legacy is a mirror reflecting today's complex entanglement of corporate power, government complicity, and the human cost of profiteering on dependency. As the 19th century aged, the Sassoons expanded their reach into finance and shipping, embedding themselves deeper within the imperial economy's veins. They managed credit lines fostering further dependency, not just of markets, but of populations and governments themselves. Their empire was both concrete and spectral. Networks of money and influence that outlasted poppy fields and gunboats. Yet, beneath the grandeur, a question lingered, haunting the corridors of power and conscience. At what point does the pursuit of profit become complicity in ruin? And how do societies reckon with the inherited scars of legalized addiction, especially when those who bankrupted millions walk away cloaked in honor? The saga of the Sassoon family foreshadows the modern pharmaceutical empires that manufacture crises to sustain growth through dependency. In their rise and reign, history offers a grim blueprint of how addiction is engineered, propagated, and sanctified under the guise of commerce and civilization. But as the opium empire matured, cracks appeared in the facade. Rival merchants, changing political winds, and growing resistance both in China and India foreshadowed a reckoning. The mechanisms of control, once ironclad, were beginning to fray. This next chapter would expose the volatile intersection of empire's limits and the human costs buried beneath the surface of profit. What would become of the Sassoons' empire when the markets of addiction could no longer suppress the rising tide of revolt? And how would their legacy ripple into the transformations of the 20th century, when new powers would face the same dark allure of dependency's empire? The machinery of empire churned relentlessly forward. With each caravan loaded and each ship that crossed the Indian Ocean, the Sassoons tightened their grip, not merely on trade routes, but on the very fates of millions. David's vision was surgical in its precision. Control the fields where poppies flourished, command the factories where raw opium was refined into the refined powders and tinctures coveted by addicts from Canton to Calcutta, and monopolize the auction houses, where the product changed hands under the watchful eyes of company agents. But the Sassoon Empire's true strength lay in its invisibility. Addiction, by design, was a quiet conquest, one that required no battlefield and left no flag to wave. While British officers celebrated victories with dispatches and medals, the Sassoons orchestrated a secret invasion from within, a biochemical conquest that defanged Chinese resistance not with cannonballs, but with a creeping societal blight. In the tea-houses of Guangzhou, the scrolls of Confucian scholars began fading next to the haze of opium smoke. The emperor's edicts warned of decay and dissolution, yet economic greed and addiction demanded otherwise. More ominously, the Chinese imperial treasury, undercut by widespread silver flight to pay for opium, found itself powerless, a fiscal hemorrhage that no army could staunch. But behind the official narrative of duty and profit, cracks were beginning to surface. The Sassoon's ascendancy revealed a chilling pattern replicated in new territories: economic dependency engineered through controlled supply and orchestrated demand, the skeleton key to unlocking markets impervious to traditional trade. This model foreshadowed modern corporate strategies rooted in planned obsolescence and psychological marketing, except here the currency was human agony. The family negotiated not just with traders and colonial officials, but with hereditary rulers and tribal chiefs, weaving a ruthless network of alliances cemented by mutual greed and silence. Within India, the poppy fields expanded, uprooting traditional agriculture and forcing whole villages into the grip of commodity monoculture, turning fertile lands into gateways for addiction. The agricultural shift fueled by imperial demands sowed not just economic but social decay. Farmers dependent on unstable markets, communities destabilized by debt, and generations caught in a cycle of production for a poison they could neither consume nor control. The Sassoons, despite their wealth, were neither villains to be hanged from lamp posts nor heroes to be lionized. They were the cold calculus of empire incarnate, a mechanism of extraction concealed behind velvet gloves. As the trade boomed, moral doubts throbbed faintly in salons and empire capitals. Letters surfaced hinting at the human cost, but pragmatism outweighed conscience. Imperial officials like Lord Dalhousie praised governors who prioritized revenue over lives. The opium trade was not just tolerated but enshrined as a pillar of empire, a grim reminder that markets and morality were never meant to coexist in colonial ventures. Yet the tremors of resistance grew. Chinese officials, desperate to stem the tide, issued increasingly severe anti-opium edicts, culminating in the 1839 destruction of opium stocks by Lin Zexu, an act that plunged the British Empire into the cataclysmic Opium Wars. Here, the fragile edifice of legalized addiction was laid bare, forcing a brutal reckoning between the imperial machine and the human cost it sowed. And what of the Sassoons? For all their power, their empire was vulnerable to the very system they engineered. The wars threatened to unravel their networks. The Chinese crackdown challenged their dominance. The ethics of profit began to erode beneath the weight of justice and rebellion. Their story was no mere chronicle of greed, but a prophecy of how economic empires, built on invisible chains, can be both omnipotent and fragile. The Sassoon saga thus exposes a deep and haunting question. When civilization's progress is fueled by suffering, what then is the cost of empire? The next chapter would reveal how the world's greatest addiction empire faced its ultimate challenge, not just from armies or laws, but from the rising tide of societal collapse beneath the drug-induced haze. Would this empire of smoke and silver endure, or would it be swept away by the very forces it ignited? The opium trade was more than commerce. It was a calculated orchestration of dependency engineered at the highest levels of imperial power. The Sassoon strategy transcended mere profit. This was about controlling the lives, economies, and even the sovereignty of nations. By the mid-1830s, the family's influence surged, their reach stretching from the sprawling poppy fields of the Deccan Plateau to the bustling docks of Canton. Their factories in Bombay churned relentlessly, refining opium with unparalleled efficiency. Behind this industrial might stood an invisible web of agents, financiers, and colonial officials, all synchronized to ensure the drug's steady flow eastward. But the trade's ramifications extended far beyond balance sheets. Entire villages in India were transformed. Local farmers were coerced into poppy cultivation, trading traditional crops for a crop whose value was measured in human misery. The social fabric strained as communities wrestled with both economic dependence and the moral weight of fueling addiction abroad. In China, the effect was devastating and swift. Opium's grip spread like wildfire, devastating families, corrupting officials, and destabilizing the Qing dynasty's already fragile grip on power. The crisis escalated into violent confrontations, the Opium Wars, not mere battles over trade, but brutal clashes over sovereignty, ethics, and the limits of empire. For the Sassoons, this chaos was profit and power crystallized. Their dominance over the opium supply chain gave them leverage with the British East India Company and colonial administration, an elite syndicate shaping policy to protect and expand their interests. Yet beneath the veneer of corporate success was a profound contradiction. A family whose legacy was sown with the suffering of millions walked openly in high society, their philanthropic endeavors in Bombay's civic projects painting them as benefactors. Temples, schools, and hospitals bore their name, a moral paradox where empire-building through addiction met social respectability. This dichotomy invites a somber meditation on how empires and capitalism intertwine, how economic growth often masks exploitation, how power rewrites history while erasing its casualties. The Sassoons were not anomalies, but archetypes in the relentless human saga of wealth forged at others' expense. As the opium trade reached its apogee, new fissures began to appear, rifts between imperial powers as China's resistance hardened, cracks within the British Empire as ethical questions crept into public discourse, and tensions within the Sassoon family itself, torn between profit-driven ruthlessness and a creeping awareness of their legacy's cost. What would happen when this empire built on poison faced the reckoning of history? Could any dynasty survive the corrosive truth of its own foundation? The shadows grow longer. Empire, economics, and ethics are about to collide in a final act of devastating consequence.